We're going to get started in just a minute, everybody. Welcome, everyone, to day 2 of this year's convening Truth and Transformation 2023, Tools for Accountability, Lessons and Strategies for Racial Equity. I am extremely excited to see you back for a second day of exciting panels, our forum conversation, and the conclusion to our amazing art intervention. A few quick and important housekeeping items. If you need technical help, please email IARA, that's IARA, IARA at hks.harvard.edu. There's a different Zoom webinar link for each session today. You can find these links in your email or by looking in the chat at the end of each session. Please note the final forum session begins at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Also, please note that at 2:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, all our phones and devices will alert with a National Emergency Alert System test. This will override any silence things you have on your devices. We apologize for this slight disruption. We're going to wait it out. It'll be about 30 seconds, and then we're just going to continue on with the panel. Questions for the panelists can be submitted at any time by putting them in the Q&A tab, and we will be culling those to provide to the moderators during the Q&A portion of each panel. Please share your takeaways via Twitter and LinkedIn. Use hashtag Truth and Transformation, and don't forget to tag IARA. All keynotes and panels will be recorded, closed captioned, and sent to registrants at a later date. After the second panel today, we will have artist Jessica Valores return to continue working live on Zoom. She's creating an art piece based on all of the panels from the 2 days of Truth and Transformation. Please join us for this interactive art intervention. It was really very exciting last week. You can all learn more about today's amazing speakers on our website. And today's convening was free and open to the public. We hope to keep it that way. If you would like to donate to the IARA project, you can do so by following the Donate Now button in the chat, or head over to IARA's website, www.ira.hks.harvard.edu, and look for the donate button in the header. Finally, I must give a shout out to my mom, who turns 90 today. Happy birthday, Mom. I'd like to start the day by acknowledging the physical space upon which we hold programs and do our work, and where many of us live. This is the unceded land of the Massachusetts people. This land was stolen. As the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog indicates, the tribe are the descendants of the original people that the English invaders first encountered in what is now the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They have survived as the descendants of the first people of Massachusetts because they have retained the oral tradition of storytelling, just as their ancestors did. This tradition passes on the Massachusetts view of how the world works, its relationship with all of nature, and why things are the way they are. And the land we are on has long served as a gathering place of nations. At IARA, we seek to amplify the voices of Indigenous people across the US and globally, including as speakers at today's conference. And special thanks to the Harvard Project on Indigenous Governance and Development for connecting us with incredible Indigenous voices. We affirm the words of the Native Governance Center. Land acknowledgement is only one small part of supporting Indigenous communities. We hope our land acknowledgement statement will inspire others to stand with us in solidarity with Native nations. Now, I want to turn things over to Professor Khalil Gibran Mohammed, the faculty director of the IARA project and the Ford Foundation Professor of History, Race, and Public Policy here at the Kennedy School. Khalil.
Thanks, Thanks, Miriam. Oh, let me get rid of that little ding. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Khalil Gibran Mohammed. I'm the director of the Institutional Antiracism and Accountability Project. It's my pleasure to welcome you back to day 2 of our Truth and Transformation Conference. Today is the second part of our program. We started last Thursday on tools for accountability, lessons and strategies for racial equity. What can we learn from people at all levels, from the C-suite to the community, who have successfully pushed for accountability from the institutions they work for and within? We are still riding the waves of learning and excitement from last week, where we heard from a host of incredible leaders working on institutional accountability for racial justice across the United States. These conversations included Dr. Veronica Martinez, who spoke about using regulation to support cultural shifts in institutions, as well as Dr. Aletha Maybank, who emphasized the need for transparency as an initial step in reconciling with an organization's racist policies or practices. Our midday keynote speaker, Christine Cordero, illustrated the crucial linkages between environmental injustice and racial injustice. The two, she explained to us, are not only inextricably linked, they exacerbate each other. As I said last week to start the conference, and which bears repeating this afternoon, this conference also comes at the most urgent time in most of our lives. No matter what side of the equality versus equity divide or censorship versus truth-telling line you stand on, the future of this society and much of the world is at stake with the choices legislative, political, judicial, and private sector leaders are making right now. It is not an exaggeration to say that it is increasingly the case that many of you, if you work in the equity space, especially, may lose your job in the not too distant future. So today we have the opportunity yet again to learn the tools we need to achieve accountability, to choose truth and transformation. We can choose to lead and to join those doing this work well. This afternoon, we have two panels of outstanding speakers and a timely closing keynote conversation. We will dive into the social pressure, which has produced critical wins for justice in educational testing, First Nations rights, as well as union organizing. These wins speak to both the commitment and base of support of these efforts, but also the winning strategies which produce these justice-based outcomes. Following, we will return to IARA's foundations in looking at the role of historical reckoning as a form of institutional truth-telling by hearing from experts on how archivists, urban planners, and community leaders embed truth-telling in their work to ensure that our movements are grounded in documentation. To close our program, we have the honor of being joined by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who will be on our virtual stage tonight as an Institute of Politics Forum keynote speaker. Dr. Tatum has been an integral voice in scholarship and professional development for racial equity in education for over 40 years. We will hear from her what she has learned in her decades-long career to sustain the work for racial equity in education and democracy. I hope you will join me for all of today's fascinating sessions. Thank you again so much for being here, but most especially, I want to thank my team at the IARA Project, as well as our home here at the Ash Center as part of the Harvard Kennedy School. All of you have worked very hard to make these past 2 days, or I should say this two-day event possible. And to all of you for being part of our community. We couldn't be successful without you being part of our journey. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Erica Licht, Research Projects Director at IARA, to the stage. Erica has been engaged in racial equity and organizational change research and training for over 15 years. Prior to coming to the IARA Project, Erica served as Assistant Director at the Center on Culture, Race, and Equity at Bank Street College in New York City, and as a fellow with the Race Forward and the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, also known as GARE. Erica currently co-hosts the podcast Untying Knots, which is a podcast of the IARA Project, which I strongly encourage you to download and check out. You can get it on any of the streaming platforms. At this time, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Erica, who will moderate our first panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Khalil. Appreciate the warm welcome, and welcome to everyone out there this afternoon. We are so happy that you joined us today to spend your afternoon if you're on the East Coast or wherever you're calling in from. It's such a pleasure to be with our virtual audience and community. In the Jewish traditions, Mishnah is Pirkei Avot, chapters of the forebears, within which there's a sentiment from Rabban ben Gamaliel, who used to say, on three things does the world stand: on justice, on truth, and on peace. The text goes on to say, and some of us may have heard this before, it is not your responsibility to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. For those of us in the audience today, we may be asking a question in response. How do we actually do this work for justice, truth, and peace? We've seen the commitments from our organizations, some politicians, DEI offices, families, but those don't always translate to change. And just as Khalil, IARA's director, just reminded us, as well as in his opening last week, our efforts for justice are under extreme attack from almost every direction right now, and particularly from the legislature. Our freedom to learn, our freedom to vote, our freedom to access healthcare, our freedom to live lives free from violence are under attack. And so I'm thrilled that today's panel will feature 3 people doing the reparative work that we're looking for and in clear directions for our communities. These 3 leaders are shaping justice movements in each of their sectors and geographic contexts and providing key lessons for all of us in the struggle for racial and Indigenous justice. Their work provides these specific examples we're looking for. And they have one thing in common. That's the impact and influence of using social pressure and, as we titled the panel, turning up the heat on our institutions, on federal government, on companies to change and to shift power, to shift resources. I'm reminded of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond's definition of racism, which is race prejudice plus power. And so we're going to talk a lot about that shifting of power and pressure on power today. I'm delighted to invite to the stage first, and I'll introduce all 3 panelists, Akil Bello, who is a supplemental education and test preparation expert with almost 3 decades of experience. Akil has worked at every level of test preparation, from proctor to CEO. I can't even imagine all of those hats. And he has helped launch 2 companies and develop dozens of preparation programs, including training hundreds of instructors and helping thousands of students. He is a founding partner and CEO for Bell Curves and currently serves as Senior Director of Advocacy and Advancement at Fair Test. He is featured in a number of publications and documentaries, including The Test and the Art of Thinking, which I encourage everyone to watch at home. Leah Nicholas McKenzie is the founder of LNM Indigenous Consulting, working with Indigenous peoples, governments, organizations, and corporations to achieve transformative change, focusing on Indigenous engagement, inclusion, human rights, and reconciliation. She is a member of the Maliseet Nation at Topic in New Brunswick. She's held a number of senior roles within Indigenous organizations and the federal government, including many titles such as Chief of Staff to the National Chief at the Assembly of First Nations. And we had the immense pleasure of meeting Leah during our field work for our global justice work and project here at IARA. She has also been featured as one of the 150 Indigenous women on the influential Indigenous women timeline at the Canada School of Public Service, a true immense honor. And finally, Liz Gress is the Deputy Director of the Service Employees International Union, SEIU, Racial Justice Center. SEIU unites 2 million, you heard that, 2 million members across the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. Liz has played a crucial role in SEIU's racial justice journey since 2014 and has been on staff at the center since its inception. As a child of white Polish immigrant parents, these experiences have deeply marked her commitment to racial and economic justice. And alongside her union work, she believes in creating community. I was going to say communing, but creating community wherever you are. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited for this conversation. So let's dive in. Akil, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, and want to highlight that you've been a part of many large-scale campaigns for fair testing and assessment, including an effort in the last year to really put the pressure on the College Board to resist the political attack, which we witnessed, this assailment on the Black Studies AP curriculum. we were all watching in the news on TV as we saw what was set to be a new innovative curriculum on a critical, long erased and even misappropriated cornerstone of American history. And we watched, as a result of your efforts, the College Board go back to the drawing board. So illustrate for us what strategies and pressure worked from your campaign efforts.
Thanks for having me. First of all, it's an interesting question. I don't know that I would agree with the framing of worked. I think helped is the right framing, has created additional attention. I won't say worked until it's done, and it's not done. I think that for me, primarily, what I've endeavored to do is create attention on things that often may be overlooked. When you have a $2 billion organization that is a pseudo-governmental agency, like everyone encounters the College Board on the way to college in one way, shape, or form or another, whether they know it or not. Almost every single college-bound student encounters them. So they're ingrained in society in a way that is difficult to challenge, difficult to understand. And so I think it's important in calling attention to their misdeeds that we make sure everybody understands how they're influencing things and call out the historic as well as the current problems that they exacerbate consistently, vocally, and strongly. Right. And so I do everything I can, from conference presentations where I consistently point out historical problems as well as current problems and attach to the past the behavior of the present. Right? And I think that that's really important in recognizing that this isn't a one-time deal. Right? This is a pattern of behavior that is intrinsic to the organization. Right? And it's also important to point out when things happen, like AP psychology, I believe it is, was just challenged in Florida, and they caved. And College Board defended it strongly, which they did not do for AP African American Studies. Right? So it's really important in terms of calling attention to patterns of behavior so that those who think it may be a one-time mistake, it may be an oversight, that they recognize that it is either intentional disregard or something more sinister than that, right? Because every turn where there is an opportunity to defend racial equity, to defend history, to defend standing up for African Americans in this country through their curriculum, through their products, they choose another path. Right? And so the pattern of behavior is, I think, what I try to point out the most, right? Not just the one isolated event, and to make sure that that's broadly understood so it doesn't get swept under the rug.
Thank you so much. And whether ironic or not, the national alarm system just went off. And I just have to say, what if we had a national alarm right now for what you just shared with us, right? This is not an accident, this disregard, this, I use the word erasure, use some, incredible verbs, so to speak there. What if there was a national alert about the curriculum that you're describing?
And there should be, because this is an organization that is entrenched in K-12. Right? And so the curricular decisions they make will influence K-12 in a very important way. And this is an unelected large-scale organization with no oversight, like no governmental regulations. So how do you control them? How do you ensure that they are working in the best interest of the public? Right? The only way to do that is to apply pressure to those who have power. So that starts with public pressure, right? But in truth, it's only going to come when board members of the organization specifically call leadership to account.
That's right. Leah and Liz, before we pivot slightly, I'm curious if you have anything you want to add or respond to as the national alarm goes off again, right? Like, we're heeding the call. This is the, by the way, Jewish high holidays where we literally blow into an animal horn so that we will heed the call in our communities. So anyway, the floor is open to either of you if you want to chime in.
Well, perhaps I can just add to that and thank you. And before I start, because I'm taking the floor, I just want to thank Miriam for the land acknowledgement and also let you know that I'm joining you today from the traditional territory of my people, the Wolastoqey in New Brunswick, Canada. And Akil, I was writing frantically as you were talking because I couldn't agree more. In Canada, I always say that the challenges that we face as Indigenous peoples today are centuries in the making: the racism, the discrimination, the dispossession of our lands and territories. And one of the things that your work reminds me of is the phenomenon of residential school deniers in Canada. This was where hundreds of thousands of Indigenous children were forced to attend schools, residential, and also what were known as day schools. And many died, many suffered terrible abuses there. We weren't allowed to speak our languages and so on. And there's a group of people who are like, well, but you got a good education, or you were able to, hey, weren't you able to get a job, and be productive members of society? So really trying to call that out and work against it is going to require all of the things that you talked about. But these deniers have been around since the advent of residential schools, which started in the 1800s. And so, I love what you had to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Leah. And Liz, please.
No, I'm just really, I'll come back to this too when I have a chance to talk more about what the work that we're doing at SCIU. But Akil, what you raised about sort of attaching to the past, the behaviors of now, is just so right on, and just so important for us to hold in the work that we do, because I feel like we really need to think back to truly deeply what it is that we need to unravel as we take these fights on. And it's often not as simple as it seems. So I really appreciate that framing.
That's right. And the hundreds of years of oppression will take, hopefully not hundreds of years, but certainly a lot of effort to, unravel those systems. Just a shout out to our podcast, which is called Untying Knots for that very reason, the unraveling and the untying that we need to do. Well, this is a great transition to first uplift the work that incredible work you've been a part of, Leah, where you were a part of a team which conducted a major initiative to turn up the heat on the Canadian federal government in 2010 and prior to 2010, when the Canadian federal government was looking at its Olympic Games plans, and your work, along with many First Nations leaders and advocates, so strongly was effective to center and advance the rights of First Nations people and communities. So I'm really curious what we need to learn from your example and from this pioneering approach.
Yeah, well, maybe I can tell you a little bit of a story and some of the background, because people may not be aware of what happened there. But I must tell you first that as a human rights advocate, when I was first offered the job, I turned it down because I was worried about potential harms to human rights. But the more I got to know the Indigenous partners who were leading on this, and the more I realized it was just an incredible opportunity to advance human rights. The partners were also known as the Forehouse First Nations. They were the Lilwat, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in the Vancouver and Whistler areas. It was in their shared traditional territories that the games were being held, and they used the opportunity to assert their rights, including rights and title over their territories. They basically said, look, if you want to come here and hold these games, you're going to need our consent. You are going to have to agree to our full participation, joint decision-making, the full enjoyment, that we should have the full enjoyment of benefits from the games, because there are lots of benefits that usually roll out of these things. And this was the first and seriously only time in history that Indigenous peoples were recognized as full partners in the games. Now, at the time, Canada was opposed to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and was fighting against it, in fact. And so the Four House First Nations and their partners used the opportunity to raise awareness about the Declaration, but also to exercise the rights, the fundamental human rights that are elaborated in it. And they weren't waiting for the government to say, oh, it's okay, we agree, you have rights. They just went ahead and they did it. So what they did was they did things like protect their traditional territories and raise awareness about their sacred spaces. So for example, they did a mapping project of what they called wild spirit places. And they said to the partners, you shall not do any development in these areas because they are so critically important to us and to our people. Another project was it was along one of the highways where they put up signage and information booths in their language about the territories and stories about their territories. And one of the hereditary chiefs, Chief Gibby Jacobs, said, we will no longer be invisible in our own territories. So they were involved in more than 200 initiatives across all aspects of the games. They created partnerships with Indigenous peoples across the country. They got return of 300 acres of land. We talk about land back. This was a land back initiative. They fought for it. But some of the most significant legacies, in my view, were those that were related to Indigenous protocols and human rights. So in addition to protecting traditional territories and sacred places, they raised awareness about their protocols, their culture, their languages, their traditions, and they incorporated those things into the games for the first time ever. There were traditional ceremonies that were incorporated into the games, of course, with the approval of the people. The Four House First Nations chiefs were actually accredited as heads of states in these games. And I would also say that there was a group of youth, more than 300 from across Canada, that came to participate in the Indigenous Youth Gathering, which was, we wanted to make sure that they had a games experience and to inspire them through sport, but also to promote health and wellness. And these youth participated in the athlete welcome segment of the opening ceremonies, which was the most prominent and longest segment. So they showcased their traditional regalia and dancing styles to an audience of millions. And at the games, I was the chief of protocol for the Four House First Nations, and I sat with Indigenous leaders from across the country. And from the moment those kids took the stage, I started sobbing. And I cried for the entire hour because it was just so beautiful. But I looked around me and all of the Indigenous leaders were crying too. And I think that just shows how unusual it is that Indigenous peoples would be so prominently featured. And in fact, the late Chief Leonard George of the Tsleil-Waututh Nation, one of the Four Nations, who was a fierce advocate for his people, participated in those opening ceremonies. And he told me that he had never felt like he was part of Canada, that he'd never been respected. And during the opening ceremonies, when O Canada played, he sang it for the first time in his life at the top of his lungs. And so Canada wanted these games. And so the nations used that desire to push the various orders of Canadian governments, as well as the Olympic organizations, to do the right thing by insisting on an approach that respected their human rights.
Wow. What an incredible story. Some of which I've heard, but I'm still learning. And I just value so much what you just shared with us, Leah, and just how beautifully you illustrated the kind of trajectory and arc of that work as well. I'm curious, while we're on this topic of youth, if that's resonating anything for you, Akil or Liz, that you want to kind of jump on. I'm just struck by, this role of young people also in driving the work that you're describing.
Well, I think it's interesting because from such a seemingly disparate, unrelated topic, the themes are consistent, right? Tying together even what I was saying earlier about history, when the College Board changed AP World History and removed essentially everything before colonization by Europe, it was students out in the streets protesting, right? So the youth driving the attention to these issues, right? Other themes in what Leah said that kind of jumped out to me was sort of the implicit dangling of likely unrealized benefits. Just let us do what we're gonna do. It'll work out for you. It'll be fine, right? Like there's the consistent theme of racist abusers. I don't know what group it is. Those in power may be the simplest definition of them, who like to dangle a little something and hope that you settle for it, right? And so it reminds me of the phrase better than nothing, right? And to me, that's problematic. Thinking of better than nothing, I hadn't initially thought about this, but when the College Board launched their newest SAT, they claimed it would help promote diversity because they offered online videos with Khan Academy, right? And they claimed, David Coleman literally said something like, I've never seen a technology that has so equalized the racial divide in this country. So his claim is online videos will solve the problems associated with the test and equalize and solve racism. Like the insanity of that statement, right? And the nerve to claim that that would possibly even begin to approach that sort of solution. And to me, it sort of seems to tie into all of these other themes of hyperbolic claims of delivering solutions when in truth you're perpetuating the past, right? And so I think we have to keep that in mind as we're engaging in this work, that's the playbook. And we can't allow that playbook we can't settle, we can't appease, we can't negotiate below our lines of, past our line in the sand.
That's right. That's right. So well put. And the bar has been set so low, right? I think to both what you and Leah raised, like the most minimal demonstration of rights being honored or recognized, or equitable, curriculum or framework is like a pat on the back, so to speak. But what you're saying about the playbook and learning, from the past and from history, crucial. I work with a historian, so I can't get out of doing that. But not to say that lots of work in my professional past certainly wasn't so attentive to particularly that historical the historical through lines. Liz, anything you want to add? We're moving towards you right now anyway. And what a great segue to thinking about in this context of large scale change, what does it require and what does it look like when you're organizing thousands of members across a huge space? And within the history of union work and union organizing. So you're working with SEIU, you're working with thousands of union members, organizers. Help us understand the impact of rallying these thousands of people and who are a part of a whole cross-section of unions and industries themselves within the United States.
Let me try. It is massive in many ways, and I would also I'll get to it, but there's also ways that we need more. First, I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you to IARA for putting on a conference like this that really sort of brings people together for us to figure out how we tangle with really sort of creating racial justice and creating accountability to that. So I really appreciate being able to be a part of this. So organizing thousands, hundreds of thousands, sort of working people across the country. We are in a moment. I think most folks are aware. We're seeing everything from, Amazon sort of warehouse workers organizing, to Starbucks workers who started with organizing 3 stores in Buffalo, New York, to now having hundreds of stores organized. Last week in California, legislation passed that is created a minimum wage of $20 an hour for fast food workers, and is creating a table for them to sit at and negotiate over their sort of wages and working conditions on an industry-wide level. Like, no, I wouldn't have imagined that a few years ago, right? We've got the sort of workers, the Writers Guild just settled a strike. SAG-AFTRA's still on strike, but they're winning substantial improvements for them. The UAW's out on strike in all of their, all 3 sort of major auto companies across the country. This morning, 75,000 workers are out on strike at Kaiser's, the largest healthcare strike in history. So there is, there is a movement sort of afoot around this, and incredible impact happening. People are raising wages, winning material improvements. In some cases, they're winning sort of new mechanisms to bargain with the industries that that they need to sort of improve their conditions. So it's very powerful. And the question that comes up for me when we talk about impact is how are we comparing the impact of what we're doing and achieving? Is it commensurate with the problems that we're facing? And so I would offer that certainly for SEIU, we have had a very sort of we've been asking ourselves a very sharp question about what kind of impact do we really want to make? What is the quality of it? And how sort of transformational, structural, durable does it have to be? And all of this for us is born out of our sort of journey in our union around really contending with how do we have to show up around racial justice? How do we have to understand the way that the economy and sort of racism are intimately bound? In fact, the way that we have structured our economy right now depends on structural racism to work. It depends on anti-Black racism to work and operate. That is the way we're able to have a society where, in the US, we've got three men, white, who have as much wealth as half of the rest of us, which is ridiculous. It's sort of absurd when you look at it, but it's we take it as that's normal, that's the way it should be. And in our union, we believe that's due to racism. And it's due to the way that we live in a country and in a culture that has really dug in on sort of having a hierarchy of whose work is valued, who gets attention, who has power, and who doesn't. And it's structured around race. So for us, that has really meant that over the past few years, has taken us on a journey to say, okay, so how do we really, really dig in on those implications for us and for what it means for how we can achieve economic justice for working people in the country? And it's, for us, that has meant we've had to declare that for all of our members, Black members, brown members, our white members, there's no getting to any kind of economic justice for any of us unless there is racial justice, unless we really focus in on who has been locked out of having labor rights in this country, because there are whole swaths of people that were excluded when labor rights were passed in this country. Domestic workers were excluded, agricultural workers, tipped workers, and it was explicitly because that was work done by mostly Black people. And that continues to this day. This is, Akil, to your point, what is happening now absolutely tracks back to what happened in the past. And so we have to sort of take that really sort of deep back as we look at it. And so where we're at, where we're coming to at SEIU is sort of really trying to measure and calculate how how are we focusing in on the fights and on sort of getting the impacts that actually change structures, change some of the rules, understand that the rules we're playing by now actually don't serve most working people. And so how do we have to stretch and really sort of challenge ourselves to get there in everything that we do and in the efforts that we're taking on.
And through the purposes of this conversation, I think we're certainly hoping to do that as well, really stretch the imagination of what's possible and also what learning we need to do from all the incredible work that you out there are doing, right? Like the playbook of justice movement is not blank, right? There are hundreds of years of Indigenous, Black, Latinx, Asian, and other communities of color organizing that we can follow. And those from the labor rights movement, which I so appreciate you lifting up. So the word accountability is obviously in IARA's name, not by accident, and in this conference. And so I think I'll turn back to you, Akil, first to put this question of accountability front and center. When you think about your approach and the work that you do, how are you thinking about accountability, especially for the institutions that you're putting pressure on? And I'll just tack on to that, what are we holding up the mirror to when we think about accountability? So there's institutions that have many purported commitments. They have engaged in historical harm. They're engaging in ongoing harm, especially to all of the students, that you are writing about and researching in terms of impact. So give us a sense of how you're thinking about accountability.
Sure. So it's an interesting question because I'm still stuck on tying in, thinking about what Liz said. I kind of encourage everybody to go back and I want to listen to Liz again and replace everything she said about working with education. Like you could just swap all the words, right? And thinking about testing and educational access and higher ed, which is really where I focus, right? I don't think about work on a day-to-day basis, but I listen to Liz and I listen to Leah, and it's like, yeah, that. Like we're all saying the same things in a different sphere, right? But particularly what struck me was the hierarchy. College Board was designed to reinforce the hierarchy. It was designed, right? Like the literal design of a standardized test is to create a distribution that says these people are better than those, right? And so to tie that all into accountability, I think I tend to try to force the acknowledgement of behaviors and consequences, right? I hope in forcing the acknowledgement of those behaviors and consequences that we also force change, right? Whether it's through calling them out and calling out, the CEO of College Board by name who says, we're going to take an unflinching look at African-American history and then flinches at every turn the minute DeSantis says, maybe we won't buy your product. Right? And pointing out that at every decision point where you had the choice of making money or promoting justice, it seems that the decision was to make money. So I hope in pointing out these things that we create an environment of knowledge and of pressure that forces those who are in the position to make the change happen to actually change, right? And I think it's important to recognize the impact of these things, right? You're creating a product that creates small distinctions between people that are immaterial to what you're purporting to claim, right? Let's take the SAT, for instance, right? College Board's big product. It helps you determine who's going to get a 3.1 or a 3.3 in their first year of college. How does that, who benefits from this? except someone who wants to reinforce a hierarchy in the admission to higher ed, in the completion of a degree, in the employment after a degree, and in the workplace. And now Liz, her whole thing takes on a whole new shape. Right? Like, so I think that, to me, like, the connection of all of this, what's fascinating, and I'm gonna stop there, when we put the panel together, I was confused. I was like, this is too disparate. I was like, we have nothing in common. I'm sitting here going, no, it's all the same. Right? So it's fascinating. I think we're all doing the same work from a different angle.
Surprise, surprise. Well, thank you, Nikhil, for just making those direct links. And that's what we hoped. I mean, I think as a institute, we're trying to study these very efforts and these very connections. And, we can only hope in a conversation like this, like that those through lines, really surface and that it feels resonant and generative, right? Like, I think this conversation thus far has been just incredibly generative, which is a great reminder to the folks watching at home. Just a little PSA, we are going to turn to questions from the audience soon, and we'd love to hear from you. There's already been some fantastic questions coming in, and please keep them coming. Leah or Liz, building on what Akil just shared about accountability, about the surprise, connectedness of this conversation. Surprise, not surprise, connectedness of this conversation.
Yeah, no, Akil, I couldn't agree more. And Liz, I was struck by your conversation about impact, because I do think about that all the time, about the impact of the games. And in Canada, an Indigenous child is more likely to end up in a jail cell than in a university classroom. And so the impact of those games, I hear from those young people, formerly young people, it was 13 years ago, all the time, to tell us that we changed their lives, literally. And they are now leaders. They are, whether they're in politics or in other fields, they are doing incredible things for their community and for their people. And when it comes to accountability, Indigenous peoples worldwide do have an incredible tool for accountability, and that is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As I mentioned, none of what happened during the games would have been possible if Indigenous peoples were fine with saying, oh yeah, we'll just be the window dressing. We're just going to bring the color. Instead, because they insisted on recognition of their rights and actually exercise them, we saw a shift, I think, in the Canadian government. The Canadian government was opposed to the UN Declaration at the time. And in 2010, a few months after the games, it said, oh, wait a minute, maybe this declaration isn't so bad. And they even cited the four host First Nations in saying, this is a great example of how we can all work together and make the world a better place. That was a problematic announcement. It was partially qualified, and that's a real problem, but I won't get into that. But I did want to say that in terms of keeping pressure on and in terms of accountability, one of the four host First Nations Olympic ambassadors was an individual named Dr. Wilton Littlechild. And Dr. Littlechild was also part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that looked at residential schools and addressed the history and legacy of them. And he's a celebrated athlete. He believes in the power of sport to achieve reconciliation. And so when the calls to justice from the TRC came out, there's a huge section on sport. And there's also a huge section on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. All of this put pressure on Canada. They finally fully endorsed the declaration without qualification in 2016. They passed legislation to implement it in 2021. And now, as of this year, we actually have an action plan. So these are all ways that we can keep this government accountable and making sure they're living up to their commitments.
Thank you so much, Leah, for weaving in this piece around the TRC's work and from an accountability perspective as well, what that ongoing and multidimensional pressure from both the commission's calls to action and recommendations to, in addition, the advocacy work around the Olympic Games and what that amounts to for the long haul. Really incredible to hear about. Liz, anything on the threads that we've been discussing at this moment?
Yeah, I want to double down, Leah, on what you raised around reckoning. Like, I think that is, there's a real sort of need for us to do that in genuine ways, at a, not, at individual level, sure, but at a sort of society level. Like, you can't, if we don't reckon with what is real about our sort of past and history, then there's no way we stand a chance of really sort of fixing what's going on, or we're going to come up with solutions that are just not hitting what the, what's really happening. So I just think that's a very powerful piece. The other piece, that the other two pieces that really jump out for me around accountability is, and some of this is from where I sit in labor organizing, is sort of, well, one, we just need to keep raising the bar. Like there really is no, so for example, in terms of work, there is no reason why poverty wage work should exist. It should be obsolete. There should be no reason that we can't have and structure our economy in a way that everyone can have enough, because it's there. It's not a zero-sum game, which we get tricked into playing sometimes ourselves. There's plenty. So I think that's a key piece, is to continually sort of hold to what we really imagine and know that the world can look like. And then for us, the thing that we're really sort of honing in on too is that we need to build vehicles that can hold accountability, because we don't have enough of them now. There are not enough working people that have access to a union, which is their vehicle, to be able to negotiate over the conditions of their work, to negotiate over what they need and what they deserve, right? And so unless we sort of create ways for that to happen, it will be, very difficult. So that's, just the other thing that I would throw in.
Thank you. This wasn't asked in the audience, but I want to drop this in to see if this resonates at all, is building on what you mentioned, Leah, around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and thinking about internationally recognized legislation or declarations that exist. Does that offer to any of you, in addition to what Leah's described, or building on that, precedent or an accountability mechanism, frankly, to think about the rights that we need to uphold in all of the different industries and in communities that you all are talking about? So internationally recognized legislation, UN, even EU, other forms of justice-based coded law that exist.
It makes me think of, like, so I don't know that there's law around justice in education so much, but definitely within the field of psychometrics, within the field of testing, there are guidelines, no laws, right? But it feels like the laws that Leah was speaking of were largely treated as guidelines. So what that has me thinking of and pondering is, how do we ensure that existing rules, guidelines, laws are equitably enforced, right? I think that's a huge problem. I'm sure within the workplace, I don't have specific citations, but I'm sure that there are workplace laws that we know are violated on a daily basis. We have, so I think even for me, it's more important because I see it sort of more often, the misuse of testing, right? I work at an organization, Fair Test. The essential mission is to prevent the misuse of testing. I can cite chapter and verse the guidelines from the testing agencies that are violated every single day, right? And so I think that we have to start that from, do these rules, laws exist? And then how do we ensure that they're applied?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and it's a compelling question, especially in the sort of area of kind of labor and economy, because it's like there is no sort of, as far as corporations go, sort of country borders don't, they like many of them transcend country borders. Some of the sort of the economic realities that we deal with are often very global in nature. And so you can't just sort of see it through, the lens of your nation or your place. But I would venture to say that we don't necessarily have or haven't put in place what needs to then be structured to be able to navigate that, right? So yeah, there's more work to do in that area.
Leah, just the invitation, if there's anything you want to add in this regard.
Yeah, well, both Akil and Liz hit on some very important things. I would say that these laws and rules and regulations are only as good as who is actually applying them and how they're being applied. And when I mentioned that Canada in 2020 said, oh, okay, the declaration isn't so bad. However, there's some things that aren't consistent with our Constitution, therefore we have a problem with them. And that's really the problem with international law, is that member states of the UN cannot pick and choose which human rights they're going to recognize. And they can't hide behind their own domestic laws to say, well, that's not compatible. They must instead rise to the international standard rather than the other way around. And so that was the problem that we had with Canada then. Now that they've done it with no qualifications, we are all watching to see if they do indeed apply or uphold these rights as Indigenous people see them under international law.
And I love this reminder, like we all need to be watching, right? It's not just the folks directly impacted by the harm that need to keep the watching. It's like we are all implicated, especially those of us who, care about justice and about true equality and, want to live in communities and societies that treat people well. I want to pick up on the legal thread, actually, because there's a great question in the chat about some of the barriers in K-12 education work. And to the person who asked the question, when it seems that schools are actually referencing legal requirements as the extent of efforts that they have to make. So I guess in other words, and maybe Akil, you can start us here, where do you see it as a roadblock when I guess the bar or limit is the legal requirements, or actually vice versa? They are seen as a explanatory mechanism for not even, moving beyond a certain degree in, as this person calls it, diversifying education. I guess we can interpret that as diversifying curriculum as well as, student body, teaching staff, etc.
So that's an interesting question because it's broad and complex. I guess I'll try to handle it, one, in a broad way, and then two, in a very narrow way. I think broadly laws do have to be the minimum standard, right? Because how else could something span regions, states, nations, internationally, right? So laws tend to be the minimum expectation. The advocacy work has to push us all towards doing more than the minimum, right? The goal shouldn't be the minimum standard. The goal should be well beyond the minimum standard. And when things fall short, at least we've met the minimum. So I think that there's work to be done to ensure that we're all working for more than the minimum, right? But then I think we also have to ensure that the laws are just, equitable, reasonable, historically accurate, all of those other things. It makes me bring this right back around to College Board and Florida. They just passed their state K-12 curriculum standards, which, and I forget the precise language, but in essence, their curricular standards for history, I believe it was, encouraged teachers, required teachers to tout the benefits of slavery, the skills that were taught. And the examples they used of people who benefited from slavery were all people who actually weren't slaves. So they created something that was historically inaccurate as the curricular standards for the state. College Board, in their standards, have something that's not far off. So when Florida was called out for it, they pointed to College Board and say, hey, but they did it too. So it has to be at every level, at every turn, we are attentive to ongoing correction of historical harm. And in this country, there is a tendency to want to overlook historical harm, as the Supreme Court just did, as the Supreme Court has done for 50 years in the banning of affirmative action and all of those sort of things. So we got rid of affirmative action. Now we're getting rid of race-conscious decision, right? Affirmative action, which hasn't been practiced in 40 odd years, was intentional about addressing historical harm. Well, they said, no, that's no good. And then again, someone challenges the mere consideration of race. And then we end up in these cases where Florida's like, not only are we not going to pay attention to what's happened historically, we just want you to say that that was good. And so the creeping of those things, right? The creeping of allowing each of those things to get subtly more and more terrible, we have to defend against, we have to fight against at every turn, or else it'll continue as it is or get worse.
And that word creep and it creeping in is just such a wonderful illustration. I was just pulling up, IARA did some of our own pinging around what you're describing in the actual, Florida state academic standards and social studies standards, where, direct the benchmark clarification, direct quote is, instruction includes how slaves develop skills which in some instances could be applied for their personal benefit. And we all need to sit with that, just as you're saying, and we all nationally need to sit with that, the implications of what you're describing, and that creep of not just denial of truth telling, but both denialistic and frankly, incorrect and exploitative telling through curriculum. Thank you. So many exciting questions, by the way, coming from the audience. So we're going to try to weave them in as much as possible, but do please keep them coming because they are certainly speaking to each other as questions. I want to turn, this is a great one that came in. And Liz, you can perhaps speak to this. What does accountability look like for the person's word problematic unions, but we could say unions with a history of being tied to industries of problematic and violent harm, which include the police and public safety. So what does accountability look like for these types of unions? And particularly, as this person notes, which have been exposed as their quote, havens for racism and white supremacy?
Thank you for that question. That's been a rough one in the labor movement, I would say. So around this, I would actually telescope us out a bit. And I'll speak sort of from my experience living and growing up in Chicago. This is a place where we also have to understand our history kind of very well and be able to trace sort of how power functions. Because I think that there's been a lot of focus on sort of police unions, rightfully so, around what's in sort of contracts that sort of creates a vehicle to get around accountability, right? But what I'll lift is the police didn't negotiate those contracts by themselves. They negotiated them with these were mutually beneficial agreements that were reached when it was where it is to the benefit of municipalities to have these kind of rules in place with their employees, because they can sort of step out of accountability to Black communities, to other communities of color. So I just think it's a bigger question than just talking about sort of what's the union piece in it, and we have to understand how it fits in sort of the bigger structure of the way that policing is able to function the way it does now.
Incredibly useful. Thank you. Speaking of that bigger structure, there's another question around corporate entities, as this person says, stepping up. I love that because it implies that they've been at oftentimes neutral or net negative in producing harm. So where are your all experiences, Leah? I don't know if you want to jump on this first, of observing corporate entities, corporations, companies stepping up in impactful and authentic ways. If so, how, and what has that advocacy looked like it, or what's been behind those efforts?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I do like about working with corporations, because I do work with a number of them, is that they are far more agile than these large government bureaucracies or even the United Nations, which of course is the largest government bureaucracy in the world. They are slow to move, they are very conservative. But when a corporation says, when the head of a corporation says, we're going to do this thing, people tend to fall in line and things tend to happen quickly. So that is one thing that I do like about corporations. I do hear you, corporations have been agents of harm. In Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company was an agent of the British government that opened this country to theft, our lands to theft, to rape of our women, to all kinds of things. That is a company that is attempting to turn around its relationship with Indigenous peoples. What I would say is that the corporation that was involved in the Olympic Games, to me, is a prime example. The chair of the board, unfortunately now passed individual by the name of Jack Poole, said, we are going to involve Indigenous peoples in these games, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's going to make our games more memorable and more interesting. And so he was really looking at engagement with Indigenous peoples from the perspective of the benefits that Indigenous peoples would bring to the games, in addition to doing it because it's the right thing or because you feel pity for Indigenous peoples. It was really a different and very refreshing approach to how a corporation might approach Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. Akil or Liz, anything you want to add on that?
I think corporations are interesting, right? Because they are theoretically more nimble. But I think we have to watch them to ensure that efforts for social justice aren't fads, right? Corporations, I respect corporations when they're honest, when they say, we will engage with this community because there's benefits to us, right? Like to me as a corporation, because we know that that's what they're motivated by. They're motivated by making money, perpetuating the brand, perpetuating their income. So to say, so all of the statements after 2020, if you track the number of corporations that followed through on those commitments, it's shockingly low, right? The AP African American Studies is a prime example. Like College Board sat on an African American Studies developed, or the idea of the program and attempts at developing it for 10 years. George Floyd happened in 2020, and now they roll it out in 3 years in Trump's America. And they, like, any intern could have told you that's a dangerous time to roll it out, you need to be ready. But somehow they weren't. They were hopping in on a fad. They were not truly committed to this program, because prior to that, they didn't roll it out because they didn't find colleges who were going to pay them or create the incentive for students to take it. So I think it's important to recognize that in thinking about corporations, their motivations have to be clear. The example that Leah gives, the CEO there seems to have a very, very clear motivation, but also a self-motivation. This is valuable to society, but also valuable to me to make my games better. I expect them to follow through on that. So I'm always watching where the value is for the corporation to whether they will follow through on the promises and the commitments that are made, or whether it's simply looking for PR benefit and not actually a true commitment to the work. And I think for advocates, we have to think about the visible and the invisible work of holding corporations to account, right? Is it behind the scenes being the leaker to whisper to a reporter what's going on? Or are you the one in the boardroom speaking to the CEO to make sure that not only do you create a DEI position, but you actually fund it and give them a budget? Right? So I think we have to think about all of those things because, again, in the end, your money tells the story.
Absolutely.
When looking at a corporation.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for bringing up these commitments, that we saw in mass waves post 2020, the horrific murder of George Floyd and other Black Americans, and what we all were witnessing as this wave of what could and many proving to be lip service, right? So as you said it better than I will, as advocates, we have to watch closely. We have to do the tracking of these commitments, and we have to be really clear on what they've yielded, if anything. So I'm going to pose one question to the whole group, round robin style, to close us out. And I think it weaves together really beautifully two questions from the audience, which is, how do we collaborate then? So, and they said something so critical in the question, how do we collaborate then? Is there space to do so, or do systems keep us far apart? So certainly these systems are, systems being systems of oppression are also baking on the division that they create in of itself of oppression of people and groups. And, as another question poses, that we're really holding on to this thread that across industries and topics, the same issues and themes exist. So speak to us as we close out, especially for those of us listening from the audience, what is valuable in terms of cross collaboration that we need to keep in mind, especially for those of us working for equity, for racial justice? What meaning do we need to make out of what we've heard from today, and how should we be collaborating with each other? So anyone feel called to kick us off? No pressure. On a panel on pressure.
Well, maybe just briefly, I can say that in Canada, I'm part of a group called the Coalition for the Human Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And what it is actually Indigenous peoples plus allies. And so we work together largely around implementation of the UN Declaration. Previously, it was just to get the declaration approved or passed at the UN. We've worked on many other things too as well. So along with Amnesty International, the Quakers and other allies, working on things like missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, for example. So coalitions are incredibly important, and I want to create a coalition with Liz and with Akil.
I love that.
I'm there, Leah, any day. Yes, so I do think that there's, coalitions are very important. I also think that sort of tracking where are the ways that finding the connections between the issues and really working them, right? So, for example, I work for a labor union. Sort of our bread and butter is sort of what's happening to the working conditions of sort of our members. However, we've got members in education, right? We've got members in healthcare. We've got members in airport. Like, we have members in lots of different industries where those issues then draw us in because those are the issues of our members, right? Our healthcare members aren't just interested in talking about what their wages and working conditions are. They're interested in talking about what's happening with our patients. What do we have to do to have better care? What's the rate, what's going on around race in that, right? our education members are deeply committed to an education that's equitable. So I think there are more connections that we know, and we just have to see them and follow them, and then figure out how we can, from wherever we sit, what's our particular contribution that we can make to those issues.
Thank you. Keel, close us out.
I think I'll take off from, I think that both Leah and Liz said it really well, and to take a piece from each of them, building coalition and identifying your contribution, I think, are the key things there, right? I think are key points to reinforce. No matter where you sit, you likely have some knowledge, insight, ability, information that someone else doesn't. So in forming or identifying your coalition, you can further the work even if you're not the one doing the work, right? So I think about the invisible impact of this work as well as the visible impact, right? I think about the people who DM me on Twitter, hey, look at this thing. And it becomes an article that I write, right? There are people like send me stuff like, don't put my name in this, but you should know. Like, so, and there's a huge value in that, right? So I think that is a informal coalition, right? But that's an informal identification of where your skills and abilities are. But when we're talking about this work, we need both the formal and the informal, the visible and the invisible. I will never, ever try to run or be a part of a labor union, but I'm absolutely building coalition with Leah and Liz. Right? So I think that we all have to find a place where we can fit into this so that the work gets done.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Akil, Leah, and Liz, for your incredible insights, wisdom, and work out there in the world that you're doing. We so appreciate it, and I'm sure that the audience today has taken so much out of this conversation. Please don't go anywhere to the audience watching. We will be back at 3:30 Eastern and have a fantastic program ahead of us, looking at historical reckoning and picking up so many of the threads that have showed up in the conference thus far. So see you in about 15 minutes. And go ahead and click on the new link on Zoom to make sure that you get to the right place.